Start the record. Okay, so hello everybody. It's a real pleasure to have with us today Davide Ponzini, who is a full professor of urban planning at the Politecnico di Milano, and he's the director of the Transnational Architecture and Urbanism lab there. He has been visiting an honorary professor in many universities, including Yale, Johns Hopkins, Columbia, and Sciences Po in Paris and TU Munich. Davide Ponzini is author of many books, and Davide, I really don't know how you do it, and many articles. And I'll highlight just three of his more recent contributions. The first I want to highlight is The New Arab Urban, Gulf Cities of Wealth, Ambition and Distress. It's co-edited with Harvey Moloch and published by New York University Press. Another recent book by him is Cultural Mega Events and Heritage, Challenges for European Cities, published by Routledge, very recent, 2023. And a bit earlier, Placemaking and Urban Development, New Challenges for Contemporary Planning, co-authored with Pier Carlo Palermo and published by Routledge as well. So today, Davide is going to talk about his recent book, Transnational Architecture and Urbanism, Rethinking How Cities Plan, Transform and Learn, which came out with Routledge in 2020. So Davide, we look very much forward to hearing your talk and to engaging with you. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria, for the invitation and also for the very generous introduction. So if I may, I will bring up my presentation and just ask you if you can confirm you can see it. And I go to full screen mode, and I can start with this. Basically, I am very happy to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. It's been quite hard for me publishing a book in April 2020. One of the pleasures is discussing the books and also traveling sometimes. So I just had some traveling started just last year, and still I'm discussing this book. The COVID pandemic, in fact, prolonged, and made this discussion more virtual than it is. But I'm happy, and I also built this other way of engaging internationally, which is, I understand, very useful. And as I mentioned, I really look forward to the discussion. I will try to briefly summarize some of the elements of the book. I will not summarize the whole book, but basically I will try to unpack the main topic, and that is how projects of prominent and iconic buildings and the central areas in contemporary cities, how they travel across space and how they affect transformation in multiple cities. And basically my question is how to understand and how to learn from those processes in order to make them better, rather than simply analyzing them and criticizing them, which is very much needed in my view, but also how to see it from a perspective of planning and making those processes possibly better. So in this sense, I will try also to conclude my speech with some messages for the urbanists who in fact are here and will listen to this lecture. And as I mentioned, I know very well the work you do at UVA, and also I will be glad to receive follow-up questions. You see my email address in this slide. Please do use it if you feel like you want to engage at any stage. So the picture you just saw is also the picture I used in the cover of the book. Transnational Architecture and Urbanism, Rethinking How Cities Plan, Transform, and Learn. Most pictures you will see in this presentation derive from a collaboration with a photographer, Michele Nastasi. I want to credit his work. And also, I will invite you to look closely to the images I used, starting from this image, which is basically at the opening of the book. As you see, it's the advertisement for the Financial Times newspaper, and it's part of the 2007 campaign, right before the financial crisis. And in this image, you basically can see most of the messages of my presentation. So if you have a very short attention span, invest all your attention in 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Just look at this. I think there are the takeaways for my presentation. And keep this in mind. It will come back. I will use it. But basically, the message is here. And you see is a composition of iconic buildings, in most cases designed by famous architects, and they clearly exist from, they are derived from different cities. And if I may describe it, from the very center of the picture at the bottom, you see the New York Stock Exchange, what we call Wall Street, perhaps the origin of, or at least one of the epicenters of this current capitalist system that perhaps sustained the creation of many of the other buildings. Right behind it, there is the two International Financial Center by Cesar Pelli, Lake Cesar Pelli, and it's in Hong Kong. And also, as we are in Europe, we sometimes see the financial center of Europe in Frankfurt. The Commerzbank, designed by Norman Foster, is to the right. And also London, another place for finance, the Birkin, another building by the same architect, Norman Foster. And behind it, you see, from Asian countries, Taipei 101 and Jinmao Tower, also by international firms. I could go on, but I trust, urban planners and architects, in fact, will recognize some of these icons. And these buildings are not just from anywhere, they are from financial centers in the world. And you may recognize, in fact, New York City, London, Shanghai, I mentioned, but also Hong Kong, and eventually Dubai. There is an important building, low-rise building from Dubai. Basically to say that this picture doesn't draw a global geography, but it draws together specifically global cities and financial capitals. There are just a few countries and a few places. And if we give a close look to the composition of those, they very much resemble a sort of Manhattan island kind of skyline. Of course, 2007, the Twin Towers were not there anymore, but the Petronas Towers are there in a way to, almost, represent them. In fact, at the end of the 1990s, the tallest building in the world, again designed by the same architect I mentioned, Cesar Pelli, before. And if you are familiar with London, you may recognize another building that also is a statement about finance. And actually between the two Petronas Towers is one building, again by Cesar Pelli, the same designer, One Canada Square. My book, I question if that is actually the building I mentioned. Here you see the two buildings, and one is in New York City, and the other is in London, Canary Wharf, new CBD of London. And it's very hard to tell which is which and where is where. Sometimes with my architectural students, I do the quiz. I will skip that for now. But also what I want to say is that basically those two projects, in fact, resemble one another And despite the fact many scholars studied either one or the other project, very few noticed the lines that link them together. And my book is exactly about this kind of situations where I try to explain the transformation of key buildings, key places in cities like New York, London, and many others by connecting the transnational mobilities of architects, developers, planners, ideas, architectural solutions, and you name them. So there are many things that travel, including buildings, if I may. But the point is, in fact, to try to understand how these buildings, you see them in place, transform the face and the form of key areas of the cities that we know. And my explanation sometimes is simple. So with my research group, the Transnational Architecture and Urbanism lab, TAU lab at Politecnico di Milano, we use fairly simple methods to track literally thousands and thousands of projects and places, and to see and make the connections, for example, of the projects of Cesar Pelli. This is not to say that what Cesar Pelli does is a copy-paste his project, but in this case there are quite strong similarities. The fact that it is the same developer also is a way to trace those trajectories, and in fact to change the typical explanation of those transformations from a general theory to a very specific transnational explanation, mid-range explanation. So let's go back for a minute, and I will try to argue and conclude on this picture why that is important. So if we go to the payoff of this campaign, of this communication campaign, it's world business in one place. So all the financial iconic buildings are put together in one place. What I contend is that this is no place. This is a placeless image. In fact, if you really try to understand what happens at the ground level, there is almost no information, and these are almost impossibly crammed together buildings that in fact do not generate any urban realm. And in this sense, I think it's important, as we see our cities in a way collecting those iconic buildings, willing to join those circles and circuits of finance and other highly specialized services, but in fact leaving behind the idea of the urban realm and how the city serves the many and not just the few. So for today, I will introduce very briefly point one, my approach, and I will argue basically about four things. So forms, context, actors, and processes. Then, of course, I will not be able to go through my book. It's a fairly lengthy work. I couldn't write less. In fact, it was longer, and it took sometimes to cut shorter, as often happened. But I will concentrate on 3 of the 6 issues that I see as most pressing for contemporary cities, namely the spectacularization of contemporary architecture and the urban environment, the importance given to the persona of the architects. I stretch this concept of personification, and in fact, the transfer of projects, as we saw some of that all in the first picture. So the tallest building, the most spectacular forms, the importance of certain architects. I mentioned Cesar Pelli, but also the transfer of solutions. Remember New York, London connection. Finally, I will take some 5 minutes at the end to try to wrap it up, but also to try to send some messages to the architects and urbanists of the future. So as I mentioned, the importance of this approach, I think it can be summarized simply by saying that typically colleagues of ours explain urban globalization as the outcome of fairly general forces, the capitalist system, neoliberal political ideology, and through that, the argument is that cities are becoming, or just certain sections of cities are becoming one like the other, central business districts, skyscrapers, waterfront, iconic museums. And so, in a way, the picture depicted by a number of critical scholars in the urban geography discipline as well as planning discipline, that basically globalization does it, or in a way, cities are doomed to become one more like the other. I think these kind of general theories are important. I use them a lot, but I'm convinced that a more specific explanation of those trajectories, of those transformations, may not only help understanding those processes, but also make planners and architects and policymakers find ways to come to terms with them, to deal with them, to improve the situation, rather than simply blame it on this or the other architect or investors or planner. I think that, of course, this is a very vast realm, and there are subjects that in fact, in the book, I say I cannot cover. This is a very important realm for financialization of the built environment, for tourism, or other topics that I couldn't investigate. But I think some of the issues, like making spectacles out of buildings and places, are very important and very common in many cities of the world. The way I approach this topic is fairly simple. I basically developed a framework in 4 dimensions to analyze processes and projects, and in a way compare them transnationally to understand and see the links. So first, I study the built forms of the projects. So by saying this, I'm not into the aesthetics of the architecture nor the technicalities of the architecture. On the contrary, I try to understand how those forms connect to the city and to the immediate surroundings of the building or of the complex or of the mega project. I see those at multiple scales. Sometimes, in order to understand one building or icon or a large investment, one needs to go all the way up to a national level to see what that does it for, say, a nation building project or national policies. Third, I argue that those are not impersonal transformations. One needs to see the actors and the agents and name them and try to follow their trajectories over time and see the networks they are part of. Fourth, urban transformation doesn't occur overnight. It's something that takes place, and the analysis I carry out is typically over time. So I try to understand what was before in place and what kind of changes the projects implied, and how the implementation went on, and all that takes time. So forms, context, actors, and processes. So we can start from spectacularization. This is the skyline and waterfront of Hong Kong. You can see, some of these buildings are quite famous. The tallest is the one that was in the previous Financial Times picture, but others are also by name architects. Yao Ming Pei, Norman Foster, also named in the previous picture. And this is what happens every night, at least before COVID. I'm not sure what's going on today. But those buildings were literally presented as in a show of light, of music, and people went there, took pictures of the urban environment, and made their selfies, and bought their products and enjoyed the environment. Of course, this is nothing very special of Hong Kong, because the same happens. For example, this is the tip of Manhattan, as was also in a way resembling the picture I showed. And you see the Freedom Tower, the tower that took place, that is now where the Twin Towers were before 2011. And of course, this goes all the way up to record-breaking buildings. This is an actual picture. It's not a rendering it's an early picture of the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world in Dubai. What this picture shows is not only the building, but also the surroundings. And basically to show how unorganized and almost irrelevant is the planning of whatever was around this spectacular building. So all the eyes were concentrated on the building, as well as on the record-breaking fountain at the foot of the building. Basically, once again, to say that those are elements that are now used to attract tourists, and in fact, they become a spectacle. I use an extreme example and also a part of a long-term research of mine in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates, the capital of that country. This is what you see at the center is the typical magazine you get when you go on board on airplanes. And I was doing my research and traveling. Malaysia Airlines was the flight. And I was quite puzzled because this is the typical magazine you get to buy another ticket to go somewhere and to see something. And in fact, the name is Going Places. And what I found back then, it was the end of the 2000s, was in fact no place. It is a model. What you see in the cover is a model of the Guggenheim Museum in Abu Dhabi that, in fact, as of today, is still under construction. So what they were selling were no places, as the image we saw. And of course, I was doing research about that place that is expected to become one of the largest museum complex, museum district in the region, and including the Louvre Museum, designed by Jean Nouvel, as you know, opened a few years ago, and a number of other spectacular buildings. This is the answer I received when we asked for an interview and for visiting the Saadiyat Island. This is the name of where the district is rising today. And basically the answer was, we are taking good care of the spectacle about the construction site, but you go and see the visitor center. Bottom line, you go and see the installations we have in an exhibition and don't go there. In fact, we went there, and what was there? The model on a big poster, but not much more. And it's part of this, perhaps extreme manifestation of what goes on in the cities that one can see in the Gulf. Of course, that building again reiterates another story, that is the story of Bilbao, end of 2000s, a very important project, Guggenheim Museum, designed by Frank Gehry, and again the same organization in Abu Dhabi with the same architect. Frank Gehry hired to do basically a similar project, but much bigger. Of course, this is another aspect of spectacle. You need to go bigger and bigger over time. This picture, I think, is also important because it shows that the museum is just one little piece on a larger master plan. The building you see behind there is, in fact, the tallest building in town. And guess what? It was designed by Cesar Pelli, who also master planned the area. And it was part of a much larger, set of investments, a new subway system, larger infrastructure. And just to say that those, if I may, flying circuses, in fact, travel around the world. And what we did is also to track important cultural institutions such as the Guggenheim Foundation, how they traveled around the world and in fact try to sell package deals with a museum and a famous architect. According to the records, the director of the Guggenheim Foundation, Tom Krantz, declared to have received in those years about 60 requests for the Guggenheim effect, for the Bilbao effect. So, in fact, museum cum archistar expected to transform the fate of a city. So, of course, Abu Dhabi's example, again, is extreme. They have the Louvre, again, another transnational connection to Paris. In fact, a quite controversial one. But in fact, the process is ongoing, quite spectacular, I might say. The museum is very amusing. I confess, I go every time I'm there. I go visit it. I'm not contending it's not a good piece of architecture. What I'm saying is basically that is there for the spectacle it generates. And what the architect, Jean Nouvel, this is the name of the French architect who designed it, says is that this is, a very special solution for the context. And this is, basically one of the principles he has at heart. And we will see this also later in my presentation, but it's important to say that the kind of light that is there is used through this gigantic dome, multi-layered dome you see at the top of this picture, also the way it frames the landscape, and apparently also the way those white boxes you see right and left, there are the exhibition, spaces. In fact, they are intended to resonate with the Medina, with the Islamic, some of the Islamic settlements. But in fact, the situation in Abu Dhabi is of a very generic city. So despite they have these clusters of important skyscrapers you see back there, or famous landmark building like the Louvre, the actual landscape of the city is very generic. This could be almost anywhere. So the question is that spectacle may not generate the effects that the city expects. So spectacle may concentrate the attention on few points and in fact let the rest of the city go in other directions, or even have a generic effect of becoming a city more like many others. I'm not saying that this is true for all cities that go for spectacle, but I say that as a trend, looking at a number of projects, this is controversial and also, in fact, tends to prioritize certain groups and reinforce the wealth generation for certain groups, and in fact, leave behind many others in terms of their opportunities, but also, most importantly for this book, the forms of those parts of the city that are simply not included in the circuit of tourism and of spectacularization. In the long term, this is not a good idea to invest so much energies and money. I can skip and go to the second issue, that is personification. I come back to my city, Milan. Here is a fairly large development project called City Life, and it's this square that you see at the center of this rendering of this picture. Now is almost entirely built after some 15 years of works. What you see here, basically at the center, is a composition of 3 skyscrapers that originally were named after their designers. And also to the front, you see residence complexes again named after those architects I will show in a minute. This is City Life. It's at the very center of a scheme that since the 2000s was supposed to drive large-scale development projects in the region, opening up a very concentric and close form of the city, and in fact generating new opportunities for investments. You probably heard about the Expo area or the new fairground, as well as of the Porta Nuova development at the center. These are materials, official materials from the City Life advertisement, and literally they name the tower Zaha Hadid Tower, Lipskin Tower, Izozaki Tower. And today, if you are wealthy enough, you can buy a residence Hadid apartment or a resident Lipskin apartment. And in fact, they are used to enhance the real estate value of the land, as the project was assigned through a bid where international funds came in and bid not only with through a financial figure, but also through the projects. And the project that won, in fact, had the highest figure, no question. But in order to reach that and make that credible by the financial system, they had to brand it. And the brand is the persona of the architect that allows the same apartment to be sold for a higher price. So this is exactly embedded into the system that, again, my argument is that it may help making more money, but doesn't necessarily generate a better city or better urban forms. This is the problem I'm addressing in my research. And this is very clear. I mean, since the early photographs, it's not only the high-rise buildings that are problematic. Of course, the debate was, I think, deceiving in a way, concentrating. I like the skyscraper. I don't like the skyscraper. The point is that they introduced building types and, in fact, fractured the urban fabric in this way, and almost unseen typologies generated semi-gated communities in what was supposed to be a public park. Very important public gain for the community is the park I mentioned, as well as the Contemporary Art Museum of Milan. Believe it or not, Milan is at the center of contemporary art market in the region, but it has no museum. So they said, okay, it's going to be big. We're going to make big money with the towers and the luxury apartments, but then the city will finally get the museum. And the same architect, Daniel Lipskin, will design a museum exactly for Milan. As you see, it's a square footprint that rotates and turns into a circle. And it's supposed to be inspired by Milan. In fact, the place where Leonardo, of course, used to live and operate, and the Vitruvian Man, so the squaring the circle, was part of this narrative. And the quote by Daniel Lipskin, the museum is designed solely for Milan, the city of Milan, the best city for architecture, end quote. And this is the next project by Daniel Lipskin in Kosovo. I don't want to, comment or discuss it, but in fact, I leave it to your imagination to see where it comes from. Nor the Milan nor the Pristina projects were built, but the point is, again, to see this in connection. And this is the formerly called Izozaki Tower, now Allianz Tower, that you see, second tallest building in the city of Milan and in Italy. And to bottom right, you see the model by the same architect for a station in mid-1980s in Tokyo. So again, of course, I'm not saying it's the exact same, but I contend that that form, that functioning, in fact, fits both well in on top of a station of Tokyo, of 1980s Tokyo, and in the 2010s Milan. So the problem again, I don't blame it all on, square on the architects. I think the city, in fact, was quite absent, and the fact that they expected the architects and the big money to fix the planning for that part of the city was delusionary. In fact, they took the risk to leave it to the private sector, and I think those damaged the private sector as well. So most international investors left the City Life project, and they had tremendous problems with completing the project, occupancy originally. They even discussed about turning the high-rise towers into residential, which of course from a planning point of view doesn't make much sense, but in fact this was quite problematic and took 15 years to be completed. So again, we can go back to this picture to for the third and last bit of the book I'm presenting. I mentioned the Gherkin, this quite important and iconic building for the 2000s in the city of London. I'm sure you all have seen it or heard about it, designed by Norman Foster. During those same years, there was another project that, in fact, was quite similar and as successful as the Swiss Re Tower. This is the name, the original name of what is called the Gherkin Tower, in Barcelona by another designer, Jean Nouvel. So I'm not entering the cat fight of who had the idea before. My architect colleagues, in fact, have their own theories. I frankly, don't see the point. In Barcelona, in fact, you cannot avoid seeing that tower. I'm going to compare this tower with another tower in Doha, in the Persian Gulf region, also by Jean Nouvel, but taller. So again, the point is to draw some links and try to make sense of those transformations. One way to do it, again, is agency, understand where the projects of Jean Nouvel were completed early in his career in Europe, expanded to Japan and North America, and finally in the Gulf region. As you see, those are spectacular buildings. They, in fact, use the same devices, lights and height to stand out. First case, you see this map. This project was at the very center of a large development vision for the east part of Barcelona. At the very center, the red dot is where the Jean Nouvel Tower is, at the center of three main axes of the city of Barcelona. This is why you can see it from almost everywhere, and part of the redevelopment of this Poble area. These pictures, in fact, show that is, at least visually, this was very, very visible. The other project is part of a very different approach, basically chopping down the city into large quadrants and large pieces of land. You see 6 is the new CBD, and is what you see bottom right. And in fact, is where this other tower, Doha Tower, of course, the name also is important because it was expected to symbolize this. And we go back to the picture of the cover of the book. You can see the tower on your left-hand side, but also you see other towers, the Sandwich Tower, the 2 Palm Towers, the Tornado Tower, and you name it. All funky shaped buildings clustered together in a situation where if you don't have a car, you literally risk your life. And the human scale you see here in this picture, in fact, I believe is quite telling. The problem here is that the CBD was not very successful, and in fact, the building almost disappeared in the skyline, the new skyline of Doha. This picture is in a way quite telling, because you can barely distinguish this, wannabe iconic building in the skyline of Doha. And the idea also here, it's also, teasing a bit the observer as it's part of a public art installation that read Realize in full, but this is to say it's real. Many of my colleagues, typically, the most critical ones, say this is just, it's just because of the Gulf. It's just the extreme, and it's, if I may, I heard this many times, it's the craziness of, Gulf region urbanization. But then I show typically this other picture where you have the walkie-talkie, the cheese grater, the gherkin, the this and that. And in a way, it's hard also to distinguish the same in a very central city of the European and Western system. So I'm going to argue once again that this is more and more similar to what we saw as No Place, as the Financial Times. So this transfer, in a way, is a strong means for homogenization and for, in fact, obliterating the sense of place, sometimes leaving behind the public space and also the infrastructure that serves the many, rather than the few that make money out of real estate. Conclusions, of course, why this all happened. There are ways to reassure investors and decision makers. This is a good way to transform the city. So it was a great success in Barcelona. Why not doing the same in Doha? It made the Bilbao effect in Spain. Why shouldn't we expect the same to happen again in other 60 cities all across the world? It's not something irrelevant. Dozens and dozens of cities trying to make the same. And we also, in another research, we tracked how many cities started culture-led waterfront redevelopments in Europe. And after the end of the 1990s, there were dozens and dozens. So it's something that, is relevant, and it's, in its effect, very concrete effect on the ways in which cities not only see themselves, but also change the form of their built environment and basically urban life. The question is, if one sees Barcelona versus Doha, one can also see how urban design and urban planning can, in fact, improve the effects of those buildings and the activity of those activities of those architects, as long as the public sector asks for more, asks for connection with the context rather than simply wannabe icon. So this is the last slide, and I simply have a few takeaways that are, just don't focus on the big narratives, whether it be, the Bilbao effect, or was the creative city, is today the smart city, or sustainability as, buzzword, but precisely try to see that in place. All those are valuable, concepts and ideas, but they have to deal with local problems rather than simply reiterate arguably, all positive global narratives. The second is to see those in place in order to learn critically. So in my book, I summarize the observation of dozens of case studies, and I believe none of them were, in fact, celebratory of what happened. But also, I tried not to be antagonistic, but try to, as I mentioned early in the presentation, to find ways to, making those better. And I'm afraid I have a bias for hope, but I think without that, one risks to, end up in a trap that, just giving up and saying we have to reform the whole world before seeing a better city. And again, process is important, and the kind of knowledge we can generate as researchers is, of course, important in terms of generalization, but is as much as important in terms of knowledge that policymakers can use. And at the end of the day, I may not agree with all decision makers, investors, architects, but I think that if they see what paradoxically goes against their interest, so the fact that they make a project to distinguish their image, and what they get in turn is an homogeneous image, I think they will listen and in fact improve the situation. So as long as they can find a way to make those projects better, I think that those are important contributions to the public debate. And with this picture, I also thank you and give back the floor to Maria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Davide, for a very a succinct presentation of your book. And I know, of course, the presentation could not cover the wealth of detailed empirical documentation you have in the book. So I think all of us should just go and read further the details that are in the book. But you gave us a lot of food for thought, and hopefully we'll have a conversation. We have only 10 minutes more scheduled. So maybe if you don't need your slides, you can stop sharing, Davide, and then...
Definitely.
Thanks. And we open the floor for questions, comments, suggestions. I have a few, but I'll hold my horses for the time being. So let us take, shall we take 2 or 3, Davide, because of the shortage of time. So I had Inge, then Francesca, and then Angelos. Let's go in this round. Inge first.
Hi, Davide. It was a super nice presentation. Thank you very much. Very elaborate. I am familiar with a few of your books, definitely not all, but I enjoy very much reading them. And I actually come from an architectural background. I worked for 15 years at one of the large architecture firms that also came by a few times today. I won't tell you which. And as Maria said, I'm currently studying, sort of reflecting on that practice in a way. And you sort of alluded to it at the end, that you study indeed also from the ground. You cover a lot of different projects, but then you also study them on the ground, and I guess that needs a lot of detailed study. So I was hoping that you would give us a little bit of an insight, as well as we should read the book, as Maria said. But maybe you can give us some insight on how you study those buildings from the ground, because I think, as you also agreed, that is really important to make that distinction rather than to see them as all the same, right? Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Inge. So you're talking about methods as well. Your question is also related to methods, Inge? Yeah.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just clarify.
Yeah, and indeed, like, just for example, the last picture showed the cover picture is a picture on the ground, taken from the ground. But a lot of the pictures that we've seen today are, of course, the pictures from above or from seeing the building as a form. So I'm wondering, like, how do you also look from the ground, literally?
Thanks, Inge. And Francesca?
Thank you.
Thank you really for this presentation. Double thank you, because it brought me back also some architectural studies and working experience, as Inge said as well, for ourselves. Well, my question is more like a reflective question, let's say, to ask you to reflect a bit more on the place, on the concept of place, of space that those buildings create. You talked a bit about, indeed, you talked a lot actually about the urban form that is surrounding those buildings, and now actually it reflects on how, what I want like to ask is more on the meaning of spaces, so the meaning of those places surrounding those buildings. I remember that when I was at university, I was in love with this book of Frank Collas, Delirious New York, where basically the skyscraper it became like the urban, no? It became like the whole contenitore. Oh, I forgot the English word, but like the place that would keep all the life inside itself, and then forget about what was outside. So I hope this sparked a bit some of the answer. And I hope it is not too much open and confusing, but I will buy your book and read it, so I might try to find some answers there as well.
Thank you, Francesca. Is it okay to take a couple more questions, Davide, or do you want to?
Yeah, I can kick off with this too.
Yeah, let's do that.
Briefly,
Yeah,
I will try to be brief. First, I will start with Francesca. Yes, it's. I think the meanings attached to places and buildings are key. For example, I think one cannot understand situations like the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, and the surrounding area, it's called downtown Dubai, without understanding the meanings attached to it by the nation building project. So it's an icon, and in fact, it required quite a lot of money from the national system rather than the Dubai, quite wealthy Dubai Emirate alone. And the way in which those places are used and can be supported in terms of the flow of people. So just to give you a figure, the building is in fact a few meters away from the Dubai Mall. That is the largest mall on earth, of course, but it has some 80-90 million visitors every year. And how does it happen? Because it's near this icon for the city, and it's part of a hub that is an international hub for tourists. So Emirates Airlines is a quite prominent system, bringing in millions to the city. They take a taxi, they go in front of the building, take a selfie, and then go buy a purse or an ice cream or whatever in the mall. So without understanding the symbolic power and the surrounding and the meaning of the downtown Dubai, one cannot see just the typical explanation, that's just madness. On the contrary, is an urban machine for growth. It's a mechanism and of interest and of places that work in that direction. And one needs to understand those symbols to make sense of those places. Methods. So definitely, I've been doing a lot of multi-method analysis. Of course, we built a GIS system, very time-consuming, but fairly simple. So we have those projects in a big system that allows us to couple with basically almost unlimited open data and start to see the layers around it, but also a lot of field work. So in most cases, I went there, I spent hours, days, in some cases also together with the photographer. So for other research projects, we could go, and in fact, what we did is to make circles, at the foot of the building, 100 meters, 500 meters, 800 meters, a few kilometers, and try to see what, the visual expectations from the key points or key buildings sometimes were also agencies, so tracking the agents that brought together the building. So where the money came from and what kind of financial agencies behind it, the government, the architects. Now I'm in a project about the technology providers. It's also mind-blowing. The same technology provider basically operates in most of the projects I studied without knowing it was the same operator. And you can do it with main contractors. There are contractors that, basically build most of the large-scale projects we know. And so that is very important. And photography, also you mentioned, very important. So, of course, photography is a representation of reality, and it's how would you say, it's it has a name built in. It's purposive. It's a purposive construction of reality. So the skyline typically, aligns all buildings and doesn't allow you to see the city fabric, whereas bird's eye view tend to, again, work on vertical elements, but you see the city from the street. Typically, architects evacuate humankind from pictures, so you have those very clean geometries, but you don't understand where people went. And in fact, on the contrary, the photography we use is a lot of show a lot of the mess that is around buildings in order to understand them in place. And all that is mixed, and depending on what kind of paper you need to write or argument you need to build, you mix them. And my colleague Harry Moloch and I also coined a motto that I find funny, but it's part of the transnational analysis. And the motto is follow the building. So try to use the built environment as a way in to larger problems, larger political, social, cultural problems, and let it, guide your understanding. So,
muted. Thank you, Davide. That's this follow the building methodology sounds really important and interesting. I will extend the question floor to Angelos, and if there are other questions, we can. And I have one. Angelos, we cannot hear you, I'm afraid. You are unmuted. Yeah. If you have a screen connected.
Now is it better? Yeah, no, I'm switching. I have several microphones here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Maria, and of course, thanks, Davide. I also enjoyed it very much. I'm not an architect, but it seems that we have similar questions with architects. So my question is like a double question that has to do, because you said that at one point that you are studying also the implications of these projects. And I mean, I would like to understand more what are the sorts of implications that you study, and how they study, and what scales, what is the scales, what are the dimensions of this inquiry, let's say. I understand from what you said at your final slides that you have built an understanding of how all these projects create sort of known places all over the world. But at the local level, are you also interested on what are the implications, let's say, for its neighborhood, its city separately, and how? And talking about implications, this is the second part, is have you seen any difference between, let's say, signature architecture that happens from local designers, or like signature architecture that happens that is happening, like as you showed, like from international architects that move all over the world and like build the same or like similar places. I was thinking, like the Calatrava complex in Valencia, for instance, that is a very big thing, but it is constructed by by someone who is local. Does it make any difference for the place, or it has the same implications, more or less? It is intrinsic in the signature architecture idea, what is happening.
Thank you, Angela. Can I add something, Davide?
Sure.
It follows up from Angelos. I had a question links to Inge's project. You said you concentrate, of course, these buildings try to concentrate attention to specific points. Have you come across cases that they actually don't, fail to do that. They do not concentrate the expected attention. And then why and how that happens is a whole range of, it's a very important question. So that's my question. And then just 2 comments, because I find this very super interesting. One is, I think it would be very interesting to draw the parallels between what the modernist movement was trying to do, which was also internationalizing out architectural practice and form and all that, and what's happening today, and to, yeah, kind of compare and contrast that. We don't have time for this here, but it would be interesting to see. And then another comment is these placeless images. As you were talking about it and showing to you, they represent a no real urban realm, and I agree with you. But doesn't that exactly beautifully describe what financial capital is doing? That is, the financialization of architectural production is a speculative process, and the project you mentioned in, I think it was Dubai, shows that very well. It's a speculative project that is based on branding, place branding, architecture firm branding. And the actual project itself doesn't matter whether it's built or not. The money is made on speculative financial transactions at the global level. Real estate, but also transactions beyond real estate transactions, which have to do with values of architectural firms, values of the Guggenheim Foundation. So all sorts of financial speculative practices around that. So in effect, the building makes its money even if it's not built in the financial realm. The question then is the one you pose. That's the question you pose is the important question. What does the city take out of all these transactions? Okay, well.
Okay, great. So I will start with Angelos. Thank you for the question. Just to make it clear, I'm not an architect by training.
It's not necessary.
No, I know, I understand, but Angelos said, I'm not an architect, me neither. I don't think those projects necessarily homogenize the environment. I show how they do it. I don't simply reiterate the fact that they do it or they don't do it. So I show the how. So I shift the attention from the general theory to the how question. So, and I think it's the only way to get out of the trap of, globalization made me do it. So the mayor said, "Oh, it's the globalization, baby. It's it's what globalization asks us to do." And I don't think that's a trap both ways for boosters as well as for us as scholars. I think we need to unpack those processes more specifically. And again, for the same reason, I don't think the famous architect is necessarily good or bad. This is my official statement. But the point, and of course, I have my own personal, taste and understanding of certain attitudes. But in general, they do what they are required to do. So cities like Barcelona, they have a very strong design culture. The public administrators are very well trained, and they know exactly what to ask and what to ask for more. As opposite to situations where the architects can simply parachute their project without any idea of or any necessary connection with context. So the problem is not the designer. The problem is the project. So how specifically in that situation, the same firm, the same group of people may deliver a very good contextualized and functional project, or simply a copy-paste building that in fact doesn't work in place. And in a way, this also answers to the first question by Maria, with certain situations where they fail to attract attention. So consider the Doha Tower was supposed to be the icon for the city, and the proof is in the pudding. So if as I did, you ask to the taxi driver, can you kindly bring me to the Doha Tower? And they simply don't know what you're talking about. And, you know, as long as the Gherkin has the Gherkin as a nickname, I leave to your imagination what's the nickname in Doha about that tower. But in fact, it simply didn't work, not because it was a bad tower, but it was surrounded by similarly wannabe iconic towers and no planning and no, you know, visual hygiene, so to say, of the CBD. And what they got is a generic business district in a Gulf city, in a city of the Persian Gulf. So my understanding is that that doesn't depend, or it's not the necessary product of the financialized system we are all part of. Because of course I started from the Financial Times image, and then the payoff was we live in Financial Times, and I think we still live in Financial Times. But I think that that system doesn't necessarily generate good or bad places. It depends on agency. So certain architects are more inclined to copy paste and simply drop their building. However, if they are asked if their job is to do a good project and they are forced to do that, they do fantastic projects. And the same applies to other aspects. So certain politicians are lazy. They just want to be reelected. And if they just need to hire a famous architect, shake hand and let them do their job, they will do that. Local democracy can ask for more, can ask for not just a brand, but a very good project by a famous architect or not a famous architect. Frankly, I don't care. But the point is how that is under control by the local government. And I think that is in part an answer to how to escape from this trap. Because if one expects the system to generate places, what perhaps we will see is more places generated with similar characteristics. However, even in projects with fairly similar characteristics, I saw, for example, also integrated policies that the local administration put into place to balance back some of the negative effects of big projects. And of course, again, one can argue, yes, that's a byproduct of the same capitalist system, but in fact, we live in, this kind of system, and I wouldn't wait until, the capitalist system is overthrown to have good design, good projects, and good places. And so, of course, I am totally aware it's a bias for hope. I know it. I know it's not necessarily always the case. But in fact, I think, to my understanding, is one of the few ways in which we can see ourselves as part of the problem and as part of the solution. So we can produce knowledge that allow for a better city. Otherwise, we simply, of course, explain how a bad city is done, which is also important. But the next step is how that is done and how to make that better. Sometimes it's almost impossible, but sometimes it is possible. And I think, again, it's not only a problem of architects and financiers and greedy bankers. It's also, the way we understand what we do and the role of universities and of consultancy and all that. And also, just to conclude, I think, letting scholars and also the younger generations know about how to understand the big picture and how to understand how those architects and the money circulates also is a way to improve what will come next. As we train the planners, we train the architects, we train the geographers, public administrators, and in a way, I think this awareness also will generate better solutions, hopefully, in the future.
Thank you very much, Davide. I fully agree with you on the importance of looking forwards, onwards, and the importance of educating this new generation. and of engaging with all the actors involved, architects, planners, for making better urban futures. I fully agree. So thank you so much, Davide, for sharing your book and your ideas with us, and for engaging with us, and for giving us your time. Thank you to all of you who have been here. It was a very, I thought it was a very lively and fruitful discussion. And the talk will be on our website for people who want to visit it at a later stage. And that's the beauty of having it online. We miss the personal contact, but then it's available for a broader audience. Davide, looking forward to seeing you in person next academic year, hopefully either here or in Milano. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot again. Thank you. Have a
Thanks.
good evening. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.